Welcome to Our Time is a Garden, which is a series of nature poetry workshops for women and non-binary writers of color based in Scotland. Our final workshop was titled On a Scots Dictionary of Nature and was co-facilitated by Amanda Thomson. Amanda Thomson is a visual artist and writer who is also a lecturer at the Glasgow School of Art and makes work in and about the Highlands of Scotland. Her creative nonfiction has appeared in the Willow Herb Review, Gutter, for the online Aerial Festival, the anthology Antlers of Water, writing on the nature and environment of Scotland, edited by Kathleen Jamie, the Wild Isles, an anthology of the best British and Irish nature writing, edited by Patrick Barkham, and Gifts of Gravity and Light, an almanac for the 21st century. She's recently read an audio essay on BBC Radio 4. She earned her doctorate in interdisciplinary arts practice based around the landscapes and the forests of north of Scotland in 2013. She lives and works in Strathspey in the Scottish Highlands in Glasgow. Her first book, A Scots Dictionary of Nature, is published by Saraband Books, and a collaboration with Elizabeth Reader, Microbursts, a collection of lyric and intermedial essays, was published by Prototype Publishing in February 2021. Her second book, Belonging, will be published by Canongate in summer 2022.
That's lovely. So I'm just going to share a screen to show some images so that you have something else to look at apart from me. But yeah, I'm really delighted to be here and speak with you for about 20 minutes. And I'm really just going to talk about my work in place, and hopefully we'll have a really kind of interesting kind of discussion after it. I think I'm jumping ahead, yeah. I'm going to start kind of talking about a Scots Dictionary of Nature, but also kind of just go on to talk about my other work as well. Really focusing on my practice as a writer who makes work about the Scottish Highlands, landscape and the environment, but more, I suppose, I'm really interested in how we come to know place, how we might articulate places given their multi-layered histories and possibilities. But I'm also really interested in how we bring the kind of confluences of different knowledges that we might have in our own experience, and how that kind of impacts and how we read, interpret and make sense of place. And it's interesting I'm invited to come to you to speak as kind of about eco-writing, because I've never quite seen myself as an ecological artist or a writer particularly. My trajectory comes from loving bird watching, loving hill walking and being in the outdoors, and it's really rooted in personal experience. And I don't necessarily have a specific message in mind either. I suppose, like, we're all really aware of the Anthropocene, climate crisis and things like that, but that's not, I suppose that's not something kind of central to what I want to write about. But I think as time goes on, fundamentally what I'm interested in is what it is to pay attention and what it is to care, how we might care, and how important noticing is for caring, and that kind of thing's, I suppose, at the root of my work. And from then perhaps other layers start to begin to form. But having a way of working that explores the nuances of place, how places are made in a way. The work, I suppose, I see it as being ongoing. I see it as being like place unfinished, you know. So what I find is that everything I've done is just building and building. And sometimes there's full stops and sometimes there's kind of discrete things that I've written. But for me, it builds into this ongoing kind of exploration. So it's also often dependent on what I see and what I learn from repeated visits on different days, at different times, with different people. And also the different elements of place, of where I am, that come to the fore at different moments. And sometimes it can be due to do with memories that are triggered either of previous visits or how one thing kind of sparks something else in my head. But I thought I'd maybe start by reading just a couple of paragraphs from Belonging, which is going to be the book that's come out in Canongate in August, and it's changed its title. It's now called Belonging: Natural Histories of Place, Identity and Home. On a walk with my ecologist friend, counting regeneration of Scots pine trees in an area of moorland browsed by deer, we finished the last transect at dusk, as dusk was falling. Suddenly, almost imperceptibly, it became hard to see where I was walking or even what was underfoot. A place that had been somewhat familiar in daylight became uncanny. The contrasts and separations between sky and tree, air and solid, became indistinct as night fell. As we walked back, eventually in near darkness, to where the car was parked, it was only in the last 10 minutes that I realised where I was, and the quiet anxiety that had been building within me in proportion to the fading light only became apparent with the relief I felt when I knew where I was again. Once at a symposium, I had a conversation with someone who mentioned a conference on Black women artists. And my first thought was that my work about birds and forests and trees wasn't about being a Black woman artist, though as this is what I am. Of course it is. So for context, for years now, my work has mostly been about the Highlands of Scotland, where I did my PhD and what my PhD was about, and it's where I stay. It's a place, for those of you who don't know it, that holds the largest area of ancient native Scots pinewoods, and just to the south lies the highest range of mountains in Scotland, the Cairngorm Plateau. It's a nature reserve, it's a national park. It's incredibly beautiful and it holds many rare species dependent on this kind of habitat. And it's also a layered place where social, natural and ecological histories are entwined. And in part, my writing came as a way of sewing together the complex threads of this place. Writing's gradually come into my practice as an artist, and now I really do think it kind of sits in balance. I started off as a printmaker, so making etchings and lithographs. I've never ever stuck to printmaking. I've always looked for the best ways to articulate whatever ideas it is that I'm working on. So sometimes it's been prints like an etching, sometimes it's been an artist's book, and sometimes it's a collection of pieces that need to come together to speak to the different layers and stories I want to tell about something. I've never been one to have one thing that does everything somehow. And I think I've probably taken that same approach to writing as well now. So you'll see I'll talk about word lists. There'll be some kind of really kind of small, almost flash non-fiction pieces. There'll be other pieces that are longer and more contained, but have different elements that come into it. So I have, there'll be other elements where, Alycia talked about the book that I co-authored with Elizabeth Reader, and in that book, which is really about her parents' illnesses and death and grief, a lot of the stuff we were looking at in that book was actually the form and how you could play with the space of a page, how you could play with images of a page, how you could play with the format of the words in each page as well. So there's always that kind of way of experimentation within even writing, but the best form that works with what it is you want to do. And quite often I find there's a spark where one thing leads to another, and hopefully I'll be able to show you that with how I write and what I'm writing just now. And there'll be little side tracks and there'll be little cul-de-sacs. There'll be little kind of outlier projects that perhaps emerge. And when everything kind of comes together again or seen together again, it can take another whole, it will form another whole. And what I really love about the potential of art and writing in all its forms is its ability to open doors and trains of thoughts and to connect seemingly disparate thinking, but also for its capacity to ask questions without necessarily providing answers, or to ask different questions or provide different answers from the ones that you're perhaps expecting. So I have these questions maybe that we could think about later, but I probably hold myself, which is about how might we use what we do or what we know to draw attention, whether it's how we embody or use our bodies in space, whether it's how we make links to the past, this idea of hauntings and what the past might conjure up to the present. How might we deal and make sense of the traces that have gone before, perhaps enlivening them? And how might we use metaphors, poetry, the poetics of space, art, creativity to do that, but also what might our own skill sets, bodies and knowledge add? Being open, receptive, and also just gathering without necessarily knowing what will come of it, I think is really important as well. So I think you can never know what will spark your attention or what will grab you or make you want to make work. And my first book came out of a chance encounter in a secondhand bookshop with an old 19th century Scots dictionary. I'd already been aware of the unfamiliar language that some ecologists and foresters I was walking and talking with in relation to my PhD were using. They were using words like browsing to describe how deer nibble at new growth. We walk transects. There's a lovely, slightly disturbing word called gralach, which means to remove the intestines and innards of a deer that's been stalked. So coming across this 19th century Scots dictionary really kind of created a new direction for me. And I'm going to read an introduction. So apologies if you know the book and have read it, but the genesis for a Scots Dictionary of Nature started in 2010 in a second-hand bookshop in Edinburgh, when I came across an old 19th century dictionary of the Scottish language, compiled by John Jimison, abridged by John Johnson, and published in 1846. In opening random pages of this dictionary, I'd come across words such as timmer breeks, timber trousers, meaning coffin, and deed shack, the sound made by a woodworm in houses, so called for its clicking noise and vulgarly supposed to be a premonition of death. I loved these words, and there were so many of them that related to place, landscape, and being in the world. Words that had a resonance and a particular feeling to them that was sometimes poignant and affecting, and sometimes conveyed a prosaic descriptiveness that nonetheless spoke of close connections and an attentiveness to the nuances of landscape, what it contained, how we moved through it, and even specific times of day or year. I came across words like breakback, the harvest moon, so called by the harvest labourers because of the additional work it entailed, and who am, the moan of an owl in the warm day of summer. This old dictionary made me begin to wonder about lost connections to land and place, and perhaps even ways of seeing and being in the world. And I began to wonder what else I might find. The words I found offered access to lost worlds, I suppose, and they had a real kind of poetic, visual and imaginative appeal, but also a connectivity with a different time and a different generation, the generation of my grandparents and your siblings. And so I started to gather these words in relation to land, water, weather, words, walking, and birds. And actually they started off as a collection of, these are the dictionaries. They actually started off just as a collection of handmade books made by typing them out, transferring them into InDesign, which is a design program, and then just printing them through just an ordinary photocopier and hand stitching them using a pamphlet stitch. So a really simple kind of handmade set of books that eventually became a Scots Dictionary of Nature. And I was really interested in how words tell us stories, how when we look through the book, we find links from words that sit separately, but they reveal so many histories, lives, and ways of being, sometimes that we no longer have, but sometimes that we actually still have, but we just don't take the time and space to look and realise. And I was aware there is a danger of becoming nostalgic and sentimental, but there's some words that take us away from that. So there's words like bearscape, which means very poor land yielding little return for labour. A sour land when it's left untilled becomes swardless from too much moisture, or produces nothing but sage grasses or worthless aquatic plants. Strife rigs, debatable ground, patches of land that are common to all, but might, I suppose, might include some fighting about who owns what and who can use it and how. And Herezeld, which is the best beast in the land, which was given to the landlord on the death of a tenant. There's also descriptions that are incredibly beautiful, like Lither, which means a yielding sky when clouds undulate, or Sardún, which means to emit a plaintive cry, as some birds do. And there's also words that reveal an even more kind of everyday connection with the preternatural. Fainty grund, fainty ground, which is ground in passing over, it's deemed necessary to have a bit of bread in your pocket to prevent fainting. So it was really interesting for me how the words also began to take on a different narrative when they were taking out the context of the dictionary and placed with or near associated words. And one of the things I started doing, and it's been really lovely to do, is to kind of create almost word poems or word lists, including one which is 62 words for rainy weather. And I'm not going to read the whole thing just now, but there's words like sapless, which means rainless and dry. Lunky, which means sultry, denoting the oppressive state of the atmosphere before rain or thunder. Heavy-hearted, which means the sky is low and threatening rain. Scouthery means abounding with flying showers. A landlash is a great fall of rain accompanied by a heavy wind. And what the dictionary is also, so I'm also going to talk about where I've gone from the dictionary to where else I've gone, because it really made me think about movement and place, but also about slowing down in time. So I'm just going to read an excerpt from Biding, which was a piece that was published in the Irish Pages that was written during lockdown. Let me see how I'm doing for time. I've been thinking a lot about time lately. Perhaps it's because for the first time in ages, I've been in one place for an extended period in the spring to summer of 2020. I've watched the first buds on the larches and alders, seen the thin film of yellow pollen from the Scots pine cover seen the thin film of yellow pollen from the Scots pines cover every surface at the end of May, and waited for and watched first swallows and martins return. In these long summer hours of daylight, my understanding of duration alters, and in old Scots language dictionaries, I find words and phrases for the nuances of light and how a northern thread of it lingers from the end of one day to the beginning of the next. At the head of the dim, midsummer twilight between sunset and sunrise. Screech of day, the first appearance of dawn. Grey of the morning, dawn of the day. Day sky, the appearance of the sky at the break of day. Lichtening, dawn. Morning moon, increasing daylight. Between the sun and the sky, the interval between daybreak and sunrise. In a sense, it speaks to the importance of time and taking the time to slow down, listen and look and see what comes to you. So that question of what happens that comes to us when we sit and watch. So for a year and a half or so, I sat my camera on a corner fence post, pointing towards this tree. It was occasionally 2 or 3 times a day, it was occasionally once a week, and sometimes it was just once or twice a month. But the resulting work reveals the slow and shifting changes of season, light, and time passing. R is a Scots word for older, but it also includes notes from a shared diary of recorded sightings. Often it was the first flowers or migrant birds that were seen or heard, cuckoos, house martins, geese, primroses, anemones, tormental. A lot of the writing kind of spoke to what was simply noticed that was there in the course of the day. But over time, they build a picture of the changes of season and time and weather, when birds arrive or they don't, the dates the first flowers bloom. But over time, that also becomes a record that perhaps is there as a resource that you can pull on and bring to become something else. So you have this kind of retrospective kind of gathering. And at the time when I was filming at the time, I was just making notes about what was seen. I didn't have it in my head at all about what it might become, but actually just having that information, having that ability to notice and gather and record was really important for something that became something else. And this idea of looking and pausing and thinking and noticing becomes important, I think, for me, because there's also something important about the unseen in nature and what happens when you start to see things and record things that maybe perhaps other people don't, and you start to bring them to the attention. I've just finished having an exhibition in the CCA, which was about moths and moth trapping. The moths are a really important part of Scotland's biodiversity. There's over 1,300 species of moths recorded in Scotland, and they're an incredibly important part of the ecosystem and indicators of the health of the environment. But for a while, it took me a while for them to come into even focus of, as being something kind of, I suppose, cool and important. This is one of the images from the exhibition at the CCA. And while I was really interested in the ecological significance of moths, I was really interested in the kind of uncanniness of moth trapping, which is a moth, a bright light that's set out in a forest that pulls moths to them. And then the next day, the moths are kind of gathered and counted and named. And that's kind of resulted in another essay, which I'm not going to read here. But I also made a sound work, and you can see people kind of listening to the sound work as they're in this kind of more immersive space. But the sound work kind of lists the names of moths, which themselves are incredibly poetic and beautiful. There's also information about the kind of the different food plants that the moths are drawn to as well. But then from this, the human side, how the humans engage with these same plants in relation to kind of folklore and medicinal and material reasons. So this gathering of these different things may also create other forms. But there was also a wall piece that listed the names of moths, which themselves are beautiful and poetic and complicated in their own way, because they start to consider what it is to name things as well. But you'll see here on the right-hand side, there's asterisks, where actually some moths are called immigrants or suspected immigrants. And that immediately takes you to a completely different place and what we mean by that language. And so being able to jump from moths and nature to actually a consideration of where they are and how they sit in relation to what's named, what we mean by immigrant, how loaded that word immigrant is, even though we see it in the, I suppose, the neutral or kind of beautiful nature and how the kind of the poetics of how moths are named, but where that word kind of leaps us and takes us to as well. And I think I really like, and I'm interested in how you can have that starting point of nature, but then it can start to pull in these other themes. How am I doing for time?
You're totally fine for time. You can take a little bit more, or you could pause.
Yeah. No, I'll take, yeah, great. I'll just yeah. So this kind of question, I think, about how you combine narratives and stories and connections, I think it's just something that I'll always keep kind of bouncing back to. In the book Colours of Nature, Culture, Identity in the Natural World, Lauren E. Savoy and Alison H. Deming ask what it is to write from your fingertips, your memories, your emotional and sensory beings. They talk about writing across threads of identity that are around and within us, those defined from within and those imposed from without, to understand more fully our place on earth and connections with each other. How might we bring in and combine other narratives, experiences that are perhaps personal, perhaps social, perhaps historical, sometimes a whole mixture of things? A piece I wrote about crows, which actually was published in the Gutter magazine edition you're talking about, Alycia, started from observing how crows gather at dusk, what they call the gloaming. And then I made a video I made after watching and filming crows in flight. But in the essay, I was able to contextualize crows in a much more layered way than the video was able to convey. Let me see. So I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts from the essay as well. Rooks pair for life, and research on rooks seems to show that they remain in the sites where they breed. Some rookeries are many decades old, and they often nest in the colony where they were born. Such reliability and loyalty to place may explain why the first Sunday in March used to be referred to as Crow Sunday, the date where crows were traditionally supposed to start nest building, which takes me back. Cross Sunday is something that I found in the 19th century Scots language dictionaries I was talking about earlier. Or as D. Gilmore wrote in 1873, the day when crows commenced housekeeping for a year. What I found in starting to write this, though, is that nature can be this way into other connections, which may be apparent to us and less apparent to others. So this is another excerpt from that same essay about crows. Still, there's more to what draws me to these birds. Perhaps it is their very blackness and their othered yet connectedness. Crows have always spoken to and had a close relationship with us humans. They speak to our humanity and our connections to nature. When I look at them, I see their intelligence, their cooperation and their power, how they control the air and wind currents above a stand of trees. But I'm also aware of their association with domains more disquieting and unnerving. It is, after all, an unkindness of ravens, a murder of crows. The language of crows pulls us into a myriad of different eras, frames of reference, attitudes and realms, both everyday and preternatural, to the facts and fictions of them and how they continue to speak and crow to us. So where do I want to finish? I suppose it's about the details that you observe and which aspects you want to bring out. For me, taking time, close, slow looking, and a slow percolation to get to the final form feel really important. And I always have at the back of my mind the question of what it is to care, and what it is to take care and to be careful, and what are the myriad ways each of these considerations intersect in our lives. In my own work, I've become even more interested in personal history and how personal history and other aspects of self and family histories come into view. And for me, the essay form has been an important method of being able to combine a myriad of different approaches, knowledges and perspectives, but also I think it's helped me to think about how much of myself I want to bring into view, how much you can rely on metaphor or the metaphors within nature or the stories of nature to bring to light these other kind of questions that all of us carry and a lot of us have. How might we bring in these different knowledges? And knowledges, I think, of words and language, of place and experience, but how important the micro can be for kind of pulling out these kind of questions of that are much bigger without necessarily feeling you have to know everything about these kind of bigger problems or questions that can almost feel overpowering or overwhelming. You know, I think there's a lot to be said for just the smallest details that can just kind of start to bring these questions to light. I was going to read one more piece from Gifts of Gravity and Light, which I wrote about walking up on the Cairngorms Plateau. Would you like me to read it, or do you want to? Yeah. So I don't know if people know. This is a picture taken in winter of the Cairngorm Plateau. There's a vastness to this landscape, and even if there's a steady stream of walkers, you'll see sometimes just the tiniest speck on the horizon line. You'll have to look twice to see if they are people, deer, or rocks. You'll see bright dots of red, blue, mustard, purple Gore-Tex a couple of miles further on or behind, and congregations form at cairns, or where people stop to catch their breaths or tracks converge. Dotterel, buntings, ptarmigan, and mountain hares are so infrequently seen. It's usually a movement out of the corner of your eye that alerts you, and even then, once they're at rest, you really have to peer to find them. Sometimes you have to stop and scan the landscape, crouch down below any horizon line so that you too become, for a time, part of the land. Dotterel can sit so still, their mottled plumage exactly matching the grassy tussocks and shadows and light of the high moor. Ptarmigan blend with the granite and grasses and the last dirty patches of snow, and it's so easy to miss them if they stand stock still. The mountain hare is just another mound of snow until it bounds away. Rock ptarmigan are found only in the highest parts of Scotland. Specialists of tundra and subarctic alpine vegetation and habitats, they have the capacity to survive the most extreme conditions. They molt 3 times a year with the seasons to adapt to the habitat, to better evade detection by predators that rely on sight. They're mottled brown in summer and turn white in winter, with a grey phase which Scottish birds keep for longer than other subspecies. On these upper slopes bound mountain hares, which also change their coats to suit the season. When I do see a ptarmigan or a mountain hare, it always feels like a gift. They are, of course, striking creatures, but I love how they hide in plain sight, and that it's these most inhospitable of habitats where they are to be found. Growing up in Scotland, it's been easy to feel both visible and invisible, sometimes at the same time. Here, like elsewhere, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality can all come into play, but I've never felt estranged from the countryside, or for getting out into nature. Quite the opposite, in fact. I feel much more at home living in rural north of Scotland than I ever felt in all my years of Central Belt city living. Any hesitancy in getting out into nature is related to longer routes and remoteness and is entirely sensible. These places can be scary and dangerous, and I try not to treat being in them blithely. Vulnerability is a strange thing. There have been times, even when I've known exactly where I am out in the hills, where I've still felt exposed and just too far away. And there have been times that I've been out in Glasgow, London, Chicago, walking home, wherever that may have been, sometimes at night, sometimes during the day, where I felt an instinctive bodily fluttering too. And that's a different kind of vulnerability altogether. I will stop there.